course, science discovered that whales are members of a very different natural kind. They're, in fact, mammals. So the correct definition of fish excludes whales. Well, all right, so remember my question was, what counts as getting the definition right? Maybe we just have to look at ordinary usage, but maybe we could make a similar discovery about moral judgments or moral rules. That is to say, maybe psychology could discover that moral judgments and moral rules are a natural kind, of course, a psychological natural kind. And in fact, many philosophers and psychologists have interpreted the very influential work of Elliot Turiel on the so-called moral conventional distinction in just this way. So let me tell you a little bit about Turiel and his project, starting quite a while ago, 35 or so years ago, and inspired by that very literature that Alasdair MacIntyre was talking about, the literature on the definition of morality, and a parallel literature that had grown up at around that time in the 60s and early 70s on the definition of convention. Turiel and his associates developed an experimental paradigm that has become known as the moral conventional task. And I should say, to illuminate some of the examples I'll use, Turiel and his associates started out as developmental psychologists, so they initially focused this task on young people, children. Well, what happens in the moral conventional task? Participants, maybe I have to say for this group, maybe not. Participant, as you may or may not know, is the politically correct term for what people my age used to refer to as subjects. You can't call them subjects anymore, they're participants. Your grants get rejected if you call them subjects. All right, in the moral conventional task, participants are presented with examples of transgressions of prototypical moral rules, prototypical conventional rules, and then they're asked a series of probe questions. The questions are designed to determine, first of all, if the participants think that the action in question is wrong at all, and if so, how serious. Secondly, whether the wrongness of the transgression is, as the jargon has it, authority dependent. This needs a little unpacking. The idea goes something like this. So suppose you describe a transgression for a participant, typically a kid, and the kid has said, yes, this is wrong. You then ask, well, what if the teacher said there's no rule in this school about that kind of behavior? Would it be right then? Okay, and if the kid says, yes, well, if there's no rule against it, then it would be right. Then it counts as authority dependent. It depends on the authority of the teacher. But if the kid said, no, it was wrong and it's still wrong, no matter what the heck the teacher says, or words to that effect, then it's authority independent. Okay? Third thing they're looking at is whether the rule is general in scope. That is to say, whether the participants think it applies to everyone, everywhere, or limited in scope, just to a certain subset of people in a restricted set of circumstances. And they also go on to ask how the participant would justify the rule. Do they invoke ideas like harm, justice, and rights? Or do they use other factors? Well, what they found was really quite striking and has been enormously influential. They found when they asked about prototypical moral transgressions, like one child hitting another or one child pushing another one off the swing in the playground, and prototypical conventional transgressions, like a child talking in class without being called on by the teacher, or a boy wearing a dress to school, that the participants differed systematically in their responses to these probe questions. In particular, transgressions of prototypical moral rules, almost all of which involved somebody who'd been harmed, were judged to be wrong and more serious than transgressions of conventional rules. The wrongness is not authority dependent, it's authority independent. The violated rule was judged to be general in scope. It applies here and in other countries and at other times in history. And the judgments were justified by appeal to the harm done in the transgression. And I'll adopt the terminology that my collaborators and I have started using, calling this the signature moral profile response. All right, Transgressions of typical, prototypical conventional rules had just the opposite pattern. They were judged to be wrong but less serious. They were authority dependent. They're not general in scope. And they're not justified by appeal to harm. And I'll call that the signature conventional response pattern. All right, well, now during the last 30 years, that pattern of results that I've just described for you has been found in a really impressively diverse range of participants. Participants of different ages, some dispute about how low down you can go, but some evidence that you can find it in 3.5-year-olds, maybe earlier, but also in grade school kids, university students, adults. Participants in a variety of nationalities and cultures, including, I won't bother to read it to you, but all of those indicated on the map on the right. And participants of various different religions, including Roman Catholic and Amish and Mennonite, Dutch Reformed, Conservative and Orthodox Jews, and so on. Oops. There we go. Well, on the basis of those findings, a number of people, including a number of empirically informed philosophers concerned about issues in moral theory, have concluded that moral rules are, in fact, a natural kind. And remember, our issue here is the correct definition of morality. Well, if science can tell us the correct definition of fish and whale, science can also tell us the correct definition of morality. The crucial properties of the kind, according to these folks, are just the ones explored in the moral conventional task. Moral rules are those that are judged to have objective prescriptive force. They're not authority dependent. They're believed to hold generally, not just locally. Violations typically involve somebody who's been harmed, and the violations are typically more serious. Now, the conclusion that moral rules are a natural kind plausibly follows from the fact that there are a class of rules which exhibit what philosophers sometimes call a homeostatic cluster of properties. That is to say, there are a class of rules with this bunch of rather heterogeneous properties, but by and large, those properties go together. Okay, so you've got this cluster of properties that always adhere in one set of rules that include the prototypical moral transgressions. And also there's an important nomological, as we philosophers like to say, that just means sort of law-like generalization about members of the class. Namely, all members of the class involve harm or rights or justice. And of course, a completely parallel argument can be made for the conclusion that conventional rules are a natural kind. They're the ones that are judged not to be to have objective prescriptive force, not to hold generally. They don't involve a victim who's been harmed, and they're typically less serious. So I find this diagram helps to keep in mind the very important, influential, bold hypothesis that I'm attributing to Turiel. Two things to note about it. First of all, I should have had my pointer, that the signature profiles are a cluster of responses that typically occur together, and transgressions involving harm typically lead to the signature moral profiles. Transgressions not involving harm lead to the signature conventional profile. Well, it's not surprising that this work has had a profound impact on naturalistically oriented philosophers and on philosophically astute psychologists, because the conclusion that moral rules are a natural kind is profoundly important. Indeed, if it's true, it looks like it provides an extremely well